Hi, so my name is Kirsty Millar and I'm here to talk to you today about data management's role in multi-stream data capture. Currently a manager in clinical data management at PHASTAR, which is a CRO, a global CRO with the headquarters based in London. So one thing I just want to say before we start the presentation is being a data manager at a CRO, this is going to be very much from a CRO's perspective, most of what I'm going to talk about. However, I do think it's applicable to the data management role in innovator companies as well, but just please bear in mind that a lot of this is very focused on the role of a data manager at a CRO. So what we're going to talk about. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about what is in your database. So when I say database, what I really mean is what is in your data pool. So it once was the case that most of our data came from one source, for an ECRF. However, now we have multiple data streams and multiple data sources that we have to manage as data managers. So firstly, we're going to talk about, where does all that data come from and how do you manage it? Then I'm going to discuss interfaces. So as I said, I am a CRO data manager. So when we start talking about external data being collected outside of the ECRF, there are a number of interfaces that we need to take into consideration. Risk management. As with any DM process, it's important when we're setting it up to identify risks and manage risks during the execution of the project. Data transfer plans. So this is really getting into the nitty-gritty of some of what I'll introduce in the first few topics about what goes into a data transfer plan or data transfer agreement and some recommendations for those. Managing the data. The first four agenda items are really focused on setup activities. I'm then going to go on and talk just a little bit about managing the data. I do have a case study, depending on time I will talk about that briefly or go into a little bit more detail on that. And then I just have a final slide about the future of data management. I don't have a crystal ball. This is very much just my own personal thoughts and thoughts of my colleagues at PHASTAR about where we think data management will be in the future. So what is in your database? As I said, until recently, predominantly, most data collection was done via an eCRF, or if you go back 20 years, via a paper CRF. However, with the advancement of medical technology, we really only a very small proportion of a lot of the clinical studies that we run now collect the data in an eCRF. You'll see from this diagram on the right-hand side that when I talk about your database, as I said previously, your data, the data that you're collecting in that clinical trial can now come from a number of different sources. The sort of traditional old-fashioned way of a site entering data into paper or eCRF, and that is your only means of collection, has really seen its day. And what we're going to talk about as we move through the presentation is the issues that this causes and the considerations that you need to take into account as a data manager when you do have all these multiple streams coming into your data collection tool, and how do we manage that? And how do we make sure that that data that we are collecting is useful, can be integrated, is compatible with our S&P colleagues, and they're able to analyse at the end of the study? One of the other really important things to always think about when you're managing external data is to make sure that any systems they are using are validated and that ultimately we're complying with any regulatory requirements that are impacted on this data. So interfaces, as I said to you previously, I am a CRO data manager. As such, when we work with our sponsors, they generally have oversight of all our external vendors. And this oversight is very much documented in confidentiality agreements and contracts with those suppliers. So from this diagram, what I'm just trying to show is that a sponsor, when it's setting up a clinical trial, will have a multitude of vendors that it is using and supporting during the course of that study, and they will set up agreements and CDAs with those suppliers. However, as one of those suppliers and a data manager, where there are external vendors providing third-party data, we are the ones who are going to be receiving that data into our data management systems. And therefore, we need to think about not only the CDs and agreements between the sponsor and the supplier and ourselves, but also what we need to put in place as a data management CRO to ensure that we can manage this multitude of vendors, as we are the ones eventually who will be receiving that data and managing that data. So what do I feel that our responsibilities are? As I said, the assessments will be done by the sponsor, but as a CRO, we are receiving the data, or as a data manager, you're receiving the data. Now, this is where I think I'm talking very much from a CRO perspective, but if you are a data manager sitting at an innovator company, you can liken this to the fact that perhaps your clinical teams are the ones who are managing that contract with that external vendor and selecting those vendors, but you are the one receiving the data. So it's still that sort of triumvirate where you're perhaps not the one in control of the contract with that vendor, but you are the one receiving it. So it's important to have a discussion up front, look at what the assessments are that have been done either by your clinical team or by your sponsor if you're at a CRO, and ensure that those assessments meet your standards. Have a think about what you're going to do if there's any issues during the course of the study, especially quality issues, or if the worst happens and that supplier ceases to exist during the course of your study. What are you going to do about that, and who's going to take responsibility for sorting that out? Who defines quality? Quality can mean a number of different things to different people. In data management, quality data is something that we all work very hard and strive towards. However, perhaps somebody in a clinical team at a sponsor CRO may not quite think about quality in the same way that we do. So make sure when you're talking about quality and agreeing quality that the appropriate levels are being applied across the board and that everyone understands what those appropriate levels are. And make sure that we understand who's responsible for it. So for example, if you're using a central lab, you generally would probably expect that lab to ensure that the data that you're receiving has been QC'd, that data that you're receiving is of a reasonable quality. You're not going to be expected as that data manager receiving that data to be the one looking at every single result and making sure that they make sense. That responsibility should be put on the central lab, and you should make sure that that is defined in the contract up front. Then have a little think about validation. So when we are using a multitude of external vendors, and for example, when we're using data collected from a wearable, who's responsible to make sure that that data has been validated, or the system that is collecting that data has been validated in line with any regulations that are surrounding that data to be collected for the clinical trial? So who's responsible for it? Is it the sponsor? Is it yourself? And who's going to make sure that the right validation is in place before you receive that data? So from project start, really what I'm saying to ensure success is make sure responsibilities and communication paths are clearly defined and clearly documented. The CRO and the sponsor, or the data manager and the clinical team, we all have responsibilities to ensure that the data is being collected accurately, that the data's quality is being validated properly and is in line with regulatory requirements. So just make sure up front that you're asking the right questions and that there really is a very collaborative approach to ensuring that your data is going to be accurate and of a quality standard. Risk management. So that's all really talking about upfront setup, conversations that you need to have. I think it's probably clear that one of the major risks when you're using a multitude of vendors and third-party vendors is to data quality. So I really would recommend sitting down with all parties, with your sponsor, with your third party, and really looking at the risks associated with that particular vendor, either across the study for every vendor or one by one with each vendor, whichever way works, depending on how many different data collection tools you're using. So have a think about the quality. What is the risk to that? Have you looked at the validation of the systems they're using? Have they got a good QC plan in place at the vendor who's collecting that data? Are you sure that the quality meets the standards that you find are acceptable? Another potential risk is timelines. Depending on the length of the study, you may want the data transferred on a fairly frequent basis, once a week or so for a short-term study, or possibly not. You may not want the data, for a 5-year safety study. You may not look for the data, until maybe the first quarter after you've started the study. The thing with that is you A, need to define those timelines up front, and you B, need to adhere to those timelines. The longer you leave the first live data transfer, the less time you will have to fix that problem, and the more data will be collected potentially with an issue that you will then have to go back and correct. Have a think about compatibility and integration. And at this point, I just want to say as well, it's really important when you're setting up some of these data transfer plans and these relationships with your vendors that you include your stats and programming colleagues. Data compatibility and integration will really cause them a headache at study end, and if you haven't thought about this up front. You need to make sure that any data you collect via your eCRF and then any other data that you are pulling in for analysis can be is compatible and can be integrated to allow your S&P colleagues to analyse across the study and not just look at each data stream individually. Finally, think about data security. If that's security both for yourself, for that data to be transferred, but also security of where that data is being held and how that data is being held, to make sure that the data, you can put your hand on your heart and make sure that that data has not been manipulated in any way, shape or form from the point of collection to the point of being transferred to yourself in data management and onto S&P for analysis. So do think about security. Also just have a little think about anonymity. So depending on what the data is, if you're sending, for example, imaging data perhaps to a academic institute or something like that, they may have subject information on there that you don't want transferred into your database to ensure that the subject's anonymity is kept. So just make sure that when you're not just talking about security and making sure the data's not being manipulated, but you're making sure that you're not putting any subject information out there that shouldn't be out there. Ensure there's a plan in place and responsibilities are clear for any mitigation strategies that you have put in place. One of the easiest mitigation strategies to put in place is to do test transfers as soon as you can after study start. But make sure you put those in the plan and make sure that responsibilities are clear. And finally, really from a risk management point of view, just a reminder that during the course of study, especially a longer term study, define who's going to monitor those risks. How frequently are you going to look back at your risk register? And what are you going to do if a risk has occurred or an issue has occurred? When are you going to put that action plan in place and how are you going to escalate and communicate? And also it's important to monitor the risks as you go through the study because there may be new risks identified or risks that go away. So it's important to keep that risk register current as much as you can. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about data transfer plans per se. So I've talked a lot about the things that you need to think about and the conversations that you need to have. I would very much recommend for any third-party vendor you put in place a data transfer plan. I've also seen these called data transfer agreements or data transfer specifications. So really it's a document that is put together in accordance with any contract that is had with a third-party vendor and the risk plan that we've just talked about. One of the first things to think about when you're going to put this plan in place is whose template will you use. As a DMCRO, we have our own template. Often external companies, especially the larger labs and PK analysis places, will have their own template, and it could be potentially that your sponsor has a template or clinical have a template. So whose template will you use? Next thing to think about is who's going to review and approve. Make sure you get named individuals, and I'd very much recommend that if you are in a CRO, that you and the sponsor and the vendor all review. You don't necessarily all need to approve, but that you all review the document in detail. I'd also like to say again here, it's really would recommend that you get somebody from stats and programming to review the document because ultimately data management receiving the data, but they're the end user of the data. So it's very important that they are bought into the plans that you have as well. Also have a little think about reconciliation. Generally, I would advise trying to remove duplication as much as possible. I wouldn't recommend collecting results in the CRF and the eCRF as well as collecting results from an external vendor and then trying to reconcile them. Generally, it's often enough to just collect a date and time in the eCRF and then potentially the results come just from your external vendor. However, you still need to do a process of reconciliation at that point in time to make sure that the dates and times in the CRF and the dates and times from the external vendor match and all samples are accounted for. If you are uploading data into your eCRF database, then the process of reconciliation would be slightly different and slightly broader. But generally, I would encourage you at study setup to think about reconciliation and to define it within your data transfer plan rather than waiting to talk about it at a later date. So a little bit more detail on some of the sections that I'd recommend in your transfer plan. It sounds probably very obvious, but do make sure that you state up front in that plan, especially if you've got multiple third parties working across one single study, about what the protocol is and who's collecting what and for who. So which company is collecting it, what are they collecting, and who are they transferring to. Then have a think about the file format. For things such as PK analysis, or perhaps if you've got a wearable where you're collecting multiple data points, Excel spreadsheets or CSV files are very commonplace. However, we do get into other types of data such as images, where perhaps it's a JPEG type file that you're transferring, or a text file just with some text information on it for dates and times. So define that up front with your vendor, and also define how you're going to name those files, especially if you're going to have multiple transfers during the course of the study. Then get into the nitty-gritty. So what is it? What are the actual variables that they are going to transfer to you? Dates, times, what formats are those going to be in? Are any of those field coded fields? And if so, do they have to transfer a code list to you? And what are you going to do with this missing data? How are you going to know that that's missing data that you both know is missing or just missing? So how is that going to be defined? And you need to talk about those things up front. Also, just have a think about comments. How are you going to transfer comments to make sure that you're not going backwards and forwards about discrepancies that are easily explained, but you haven't got a comments field? Next, have a little think about transfer format. For something like lab data, you probably want that transferred in a cumulative manner. But if you're doing scans or something like that, which are sort of bespoke per subject, you probably just want them transferred once, and then you don't want them in sort of next transfer. You want them in a non-cumulative manner. Have a little think, I said before, about security and encryption and how you're going to transfer that data. Do you perhaps have a secure server that both parties can use? This is a very secure way of transferring data and sometimes negates the need to use any encryption. If you can't do that, you can do zip files, password protected emails, encryption, that kind of thing. But define that up front and make sure that both parties can open any type of encryption format that you're using. Finally, have a little think about frequency of transfers. So as I said, really recommend test transfers as soon as you can. Sometimes vendors can't provide you dummy data, but if they can, then I really would recommend test transfers as soon as you've got those contracts set up. And then define in your data transfer plan what the frequency of transfers will be during the production cycle. One thing just to bear in mind, especially if you're in the sort of longer term study, is it's usually a cost implication to transfers. So it is important that you're all on the same page at study start as to what and how many types of transfers you're going to have, because there usually is a cost implication. Finally, blinding and validation. So one thing just to always be aware of if you're running a blinded study is anything that you're being transferred from a third-party vendor going to break the blind? So for example, if you've got a PK analysis in there, it could be that you can't have that until study end because it could break the blind. So it's worth just having that conversation and being utterly clear that you're not going to break any blind by receiving data during the course of a study. And then just think about validation. So how are you going to validate that transfer process? Is it enough, for example, for the external vendor to tell you they've given you 1,000 rows in an Excel file and you check you've got 1,000 rows? Is that enough? So reconciliation, I'll just touch on this briefly. I think I've already mentioned a lot of this. So up front, define which variables are going to be reconciled. Are you going to be actually uploading your data into your ECRF database, or are you just going to be reconciling dates and times across the databases? And then have a think about who and when you're going to do this and how you're going to document that it's been done. So be clear on who and what parts of reconciliation are people taking responsibility for, how frequently you're going to do it during the course of the study, how you're going to document that you've done it, how you're going to document which particular transfer you compared against which part of the database. If you do find anything during that reconciliation process, how are you going to manage that? What's your discrepancy management process, especially if you're not uploading that into your ECRF so you can't easily generate queries? How are you going to manage that discrepancy process? And how are you going to manage data changes? If there's data changes needed either in the ECRF or in the lab, how is that managed? And just make sure, and this is probably a little point just when you're getting towards database lock, just make sure that you take into account the need for that reconciliation to happen before database sort of soft lock, and that subsequent to that you probably will need a further and clean transfer at database lock. So really just a couple of slides on the setup piece and planning for success. Engage early. Engage early with your vendors as early as you can and as early as you can get involved, and make sure that you put plans in place that are comprehensive and hold all the things that I've discussed. Plan a strategy and don't duplicate information if you can help it. Really encourage your clinical teams to not collect data in the eCRF if it can come in a validated format from an external vendor, because you're just putting the burden back on yourselves in data management to reconcile that data. And discuss with your S&P colleagues where they're going to take the data from. So are the dates and times going to come from the external vendor, or are the dates and times going to come from the eCRF, for example? Availability of data. Really think about the study activities as a whole, and this is quite important, especially if you've got multiple data streams. Make sure you're thinking about, does everything tie up? If you've got data X coming at this time point, does that fit with what's happening with perhaps data Y, or does that fit with what S&P need and when they are doing their reviews? Make sure you're looking at the study holistically and not just each individual data stream. Think about the robustness of the data. For example, wearables. That's data that's going to come from the subjects in your study. So how are they going to be trained? How is that data going to be robust? Think about all the things we talked about, compatibility, integration. But I think when it is something like this that is patient-led, such as e-diaries or wearables, you also need to be absolutely clear on how subjects are going to be trained and what the process will be if you as a data manager see that data coming in of a poor quality, how you're going to get that message back out to the subjects that things aren't quite right. So managing the data. Really this is going to be quite brief, a couple of just things to think about. You're required, as I've said, to really process and reconcile each individual data source that's coming in. However, it is really important not to just look at that data in silos. It's important to build into your processing and your data review timelines the ability to pull all that data together and review across data sets. Make sure there's quality by design for each element. Make sure that across the board you're looking for quality. I don't have a great fix personally for being able to really view and analyse across multi-stream data. Some simple things that I have used and can use are Excel and SAS programs. So it is easy, for example, to pull in different spreadsheets of data and use like a VLOOKUP type thing in your Excel spreadsheets to combine data across the board and review in a very much more holistic way. You can do a similar thing with SAS programs. And obviously, you can, if you're not a SAS programmer yourself, you can utilize your S&P colleagues to help you do this. But there are probably other ways to do this that I don't know, that perhaps you all use out there. But I think it is very important that we do this. We do this as data managers. We don't just look at the different data streams and silos. We combine the data as best we can and look at it across the board before we transfer it to our S&P colleagues. And make sure that any tools you are using, even if it's just Excel or simple SAS programs, that you validate them, because otherwise you're not 100% sure that you're viewing data correctly. But really the main thing about managing this process is to make sure that although you're doing all that needs to be done on each individual data stream, you're also looking across the board, because sometimes it's not until you look at a package of data for a subject that anomalies pop up. If I've got time quickly, I'm just going to talk about the case study and then move on to the future of data management. So this was a study run about 5 years ago. It was a small patient study, only 8 subjects. And the idea was that these subjects who were diabetic subjects were going to compare 2 different types of therapy. Really, I'm bringing this up not because of the therapy and not because of investigational product. It's because when these subjects went into the study 5 years ago, they managed their glucose levels and their insulin intake by pinpricks, because that was commonplace 5 years ago, which they maybe did a couple of times stages to check in with how their diabetes was being managed. For the purposes of this study, the subjects were fitted with something which is now commonplace, a little device that goes under the skin which monitors your glucose round the clock all the time, and that data was being uploaded in the cloud and sent into data management to have a look at. The endpoints of the study were around how many hypos a subject had. That was what they were looking at. They were being monitored for over 72 weeks. And what they were doing was looking at the frequency of hypo incidences in these subjects. Now, two things. The data manager working on this study obviously had a huge body of data being transferred on a regular basis, monitoring the glucose levels of these patients. And they noticed a couple of things quite quickly in the study. One was during the 8-week baseline run-in period, the subjects were meant to be calibrating the devices themselves. However, they were clearly struggling with this, and the data was not particularly consistent. They perhaps weren't using the device in the way that was expected. So there was a conversation with the sponsor to say, well, I think retraining's needed, and potentially the baseline run-in needs to be extended. The other thing that they noticed was that if they travelled through different time zones, it skewed the results completely. So they had to have a little workaround and a think about how they were going to manage that. The third thing that was noted was that actually both sets of subjects, if you looked at what was expected for the number of hypos for subjects with this type of diabetes, they were both significantly improving. And the reason for that was nothing to do with the therapy they were given, it was to do with the fact that they had this device inserted that they hadn't had before. So again, that was a data manager looking at trending across the subjects and realising that actually the subjects were much better placed with the device in place to manage their disease, and that really they were going to, the sponsors of the trial were going to have a little rethink about their endpoints because there wasn't going to be any significance shown. So the reason for bringing this up is just to talk about two things. One is that was a data manager interrogating a huge body of data and seeing trends and looking across the entire study, and then using that data to really go back to the sponsor and say you need to have a little bit of a rethink about your study design. So using the data to drive study design. The other thing just to say as well is that these devices are now commonplace. Nothing to do probably with this trial, but the devices are now commonplace. And again, this is the type of data that could be used for multiple trials in future. That brings me on to talk about the future. There is lots and lots of talk about big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I'm not sure as data managers we probably all completely understand what those things are and how those things are going to be useful or helpful for clinical trials in the future. Some of the things that people talk about, for example, is that, if you take placebo data, sponsor companies are probably sitting on huge databases of information on subjects who've been on placebo treatments. However, in the clinical trial design, when you're doing a placebo-controlled study, you still dose placebo subjects again and again and again and again. Could we perhaps, and this is sort of a big data thing, could we perhaps not dose so many placebo subjects and have a way using machine learning or some sort of artificial intelligence where we interrogate our databases, pull out information on subjects who fit the criteria for our trial and actually just reuse their data? Would that hold up? Would that be regulatory compliant? Who knows? But it is something that more and more companies are looking at. There is a wealth of data out there and recorded for subjects across the world. We all have our Fitbits and our Apple Watches and things where we're recording data all the time, which is sitting up in the cloud somewhere. Can pharmaceutical companies use that and harness that data to not have to run such big clinical trials anymore, but perhaps use data that's already out there? Now, what does that mean for us as data managers? Well, I think I have seen a change in the industry over the past 10 years. Along the lines of, I know 20 years ago when I first started, data management often had to fight for a seat at the table during setup. However, now, because really we are the ones who are managing the data, quality data, accurate data, we are the ones who really are advising the clinical teams on how best to receive that data and collect that data. We are being brought in a much earlier place in the clinical trial setup. And we are really driving some of that design in that clinical study by our innovative thinking around efficient and simple ways to collect accurate and quality data and to combine that to give us a package of data that we can analyse, not just in the very traditional ECRF design, we take data from subjects at real time, but in a way that we use wearables, that we use data sets that we already have and information that's already out there, be it within electronic health records or be it within innovator databases. We are the ones who are there and who are really the experts in that data collection and making sure that it's quality and accurate. So I see our role, and this is my sort of final thought of the day, I see our role really as very, very critical in the new world of multi-stream data capture. Very, very critical for clinical teams to have a good data manager on their side who can really advise on the way of collecting quality and accurate data. So that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions?